some grass.
Yeah?
And no one's home at my house. Want to come over and smoke?
Nah. It's great stuff. We'll really get high.
Yeah.
Nah, I just don't want to.
I said no one's home.
So why be so sneaky? Because it's against the law, stupid. I'm stupid? Why do you think they call it dope?
Welcome. I'm Ben Boyce. This is the Dr. Junkie Show. And today I thought I'd respond to a lot of emails I get asking me what I'm doing. Although they don't always say it that way. Sometimes they say, you won't ever make any money off this. And other times they say, why are you telling kids to use drugs? What's wrong with you? That last one is always kind of weird, because you don't have to listen very long to notice that, if anything, I'm doing the opposite of that. I guess that's the biggest irony of the drug war. It creates and worsens addictions by leaving drugs high on the back shelf of adolescence, just out of reach until we're old enough to escape the supervision of our parental figures. We don't teach kids about drugs or addiction because that's a terrifying thing for parents to do. If you have kids, you can probably run this thought experiment yourself and recognize a feeling of terror deep in your gut when you consider saying something to your child that might one day encourage them to use heroin, no matter how indirect that encouragement would be. So instead, we say things like, don't use drugs, you're stronger than that, drugs are for bad people. Our kids know better, but they aren't going to tell us that. And since we don't talk to our kids honestly and openly about drug use, it feels like anybody who does is encouraging them to use. What we really want as parents is for our kids to be the lucky ones who won't ever be tempted by drugs. We dream that they'll just be wired up in some sort of way that doesn't provide for much desire or curiosity about getting high. Of course, people like that do exist, or at least people who claim to be like that do exist. And to be fair, it would save them an awful lot of trouble. Plus, it would save us a ton of worrying. So instead of treating that outcome as incredibly unlikely, which it is, we usually just tell our kids to not use drugs. And we usually package that advice in bullshit platitudes, like, if you ever do want to use drugs, come talk to me. Now what we mean is, for God's sake, don't use drugs. And if you do, don't tell me. Allow me to live in a fantasy world where my kid doesn't experience the same trials and stressors as every other kid out there. And so our kids don't come to talk to us when they think about using, or when they use, or when their friends use. Instead, they build that world outside of our view. And as adolescents who are, in many ways, supposed to be doing just that very thing, building identities that grow to exceed those they performed as children, those secret experiences stick more than they would if they were seen as no big deal, as just a part of life, as things kids didn't have to hide from their parents. We aren't doing our kids any favors with this now intergenerational tactic of protecting ourselves from any psychological trauma we might experience from worrying about them. They're our kids. That's our job. But that's not really what I want to talk about today. I mean, it's part of it, but I want to center a larger project. This project, the Dr. Junkie Show. It's been more than a year since I last explained why I'm doing this, what I hope to accomplish, and why this project is designed the way it is. And a lot has changed since I started this show. I'm now teaching college classes inside Colorado prisons. I published a book called Dr. Junkie and another one called The Spectacle of Punishment, which comes out in April of 2023. You can pre-order it on Amazon now. And I've recorded, edited, and released more than 120 episodes of this podcast. Wow. So instead of referring you back to an early scratchy episode where I talk about why I'm doing this show, I think I'll just update the script. First, the reason for this podcast. I'm an addicted person. I spent the early 2000s mainline injecting heroin, cocaine, Oxycontin, and fentanyl. I spent a lot of that time locked up, and the final 18 months of my sentence were inside a Michigan prison, the largest walled prison on earth for much of it. And then I got out, violated my parole, and went back, like most of us do. The only reason I eventually managed to stay out of prison, to complete parole, to avoid reoffending, or rather to avoid getting caught reoffending, because almost all of us do, The only reason for any of it was luck, plain and simple. And that's a hard pill to swallow, because I'm supposed to be a success story pointing the way toward success for others who are behind me. I can't very well say, just get lucky like I did. There are things we can do to minimize recidivism, sure, but I wasn't equipped with any of them when I got out, and I didn't know enough about myself when I was released to avoid the same traps I'd fallen into plenty of times before. That's a big part of the reason I teach in prisons now, and a big part of the reason for this show. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. Let me start with why I was incarcerated. I was an addicted person shooting dope, and in the United States, that means I was either incredibly rich, which I wasn't, or that I was incredibly broke, which I was. Every day during the height of my addiction, I'd plot, hustle, and scam my way to some dope, constantly running to stay just one step ahead of the heavy opioid detox that I knew was right around the corner. It was identity theft one day, retail shoplifting the next, and when all else failed, I could always dig through an unlocked car for loose change. And all of that started a process that I'll circle back around to later, something Megan and I talked about last week, a recognition that I wasn't shit and that I'd never be shit. I was just a convicted felon, a thief, a member of Michelle Alexander's new Jim Crow, forever classified as a second-class citizen. Sure, I could maybe land a decent job someday working construction or even supervising a construction crew, but I'd never be a doctor or a lawyer or a bondsman or a service member or a politician or a doctor or a daycare worker. The list could keep going. But here's what's fucked up. I wasn't locked up for drugs. Ever. I was locked up for theft. So I didn't show up in statistics about how many people are locked up for drugs in the United States. My number didn't count. I also didn't receive any treatment for addiction while I was locked up. If you wanted to set up a revolving door for prisons, you design a system exactly like this. One that locks people up for crimes related to their addictions, but not for their addictions, then dumps them back onto the streets a few years later, untreated and re-traumatized. Then act surprised when they return over and over. That's because addiction isn't a disease. It's better thought of as a learning disorder. If you just think about how addictions work, heroin, internet, gambling, sugar, smoking, alcohol, all of them, we humans stumble onto some tool that works to alleviate our depression, or to reduce our stress, or to pump us up. It works to make us feel better. So we use it again in the future when we want to feel better again. That's what learning is. We find a new solution to a problem, we test it out, and if it works, we learn to use it again. No disorder so far. But when those substances or behaviors stop working to alleviate our negative states, and when they begin to actually reduce our quality of life or increase our discomfort, we exhibit disordered learning. We don't learn to stop using it even though it's not working anymore. Taking someone who's stuck in this repetitive cycle of self-medication and making their life worse by jail or prison, that's a sure way to press them to keep using once the punishment is over. And that's exactly what happened to me when I was released. I went back to shooting dope because life sucked and dope worked, at least at first. I was trapped. Not only could I have violated my parole just for using drugs, but I was also paying huge prices for dope. I've talked about this before, so I won't go too deep here, but heroin and cocaine cost less than $1 a gram to produce from raw materials. Then they sell for upwards of $1,000 per gram on the streets of the United States. Fentanyl's a bit cheaper than heroin, both to produce and to sell on the streets, because it can be made from synthetic ingredients. And since it's so much more potent than heroin, we find ourselves smack in the middle of what feels like a never-ending overdose crisis in this country. It wouldn't even be happening if it weren't for the combination of fentanyl-like drugs that are too potent to safely use on the streets, COVID anxiety and loss of our support networks related to that, and the poison that is early-era social media, the mudhole we currently live in with Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. This trifecta, COVID, social media, and fentanyl, it was predictable and avoidable. And that's where this podcast began. As COVID took off and social media soured up, I realized we were headed for a place that was somehow worse than where we all were at the time. Last year, 109,000 U.S. deaths were blamed on drug overdoses. 3 years ago, a death related to the war on drugs is what initially instigated this podcast. I lost a good friend, and I had to do something with this angry energy I had. Which brings me to the name, Dr. Junkie, which I've received no shortage of both snarky emails and sincere advice suggesting I change it. I chose the name to get ahead of the people who would discredit me or others like me because we're convicted of crimes or because we use drugs. My goal is to press through two types of preconceptions. One that paints drug users as idiots, and the other that paints doctors as sober, boring, just-say-knowers. The name is also meant to get the unsavory stuff out of the way. The part where you find out that I'm a bad guy, a convicted felon, a drug user. No one listens to a dozen episodes of this podcast before realizing the host is one of those people. You usually know within a few minutes, if not a few seconds. And per bell hooks, the name's also a shout out to the power of language in shaping our beliefs, our perceptions, and really, the world around us. That bit about me only managing to stay out of prison by sheer luck, it's no joke. When I was released, one of my parole requirements was to attend group meetings for re-entering parolees. Once I failed a few drug tests, those requirements were extended to include drug classes. And inevitably, those classes were based on the 12-step model of recovery. And because of that, they didn't work for me. So with the weight of a permanent felony record and a host of hoops to jump through, I started using drugs again. I never really stopped using after that, so much as I sublimated my most problematic drug use towards other things that didn't burn so much of my energy, like learning as a drug, and later, like teaching as a drug. My PhD showed up after a decade of losing myself to the learning process. I never actually thought I'd complete it, let alone use it. Turns out I would do both. You can use drugs and be successful. And you can stop using drugs and be happy. But whatever was driving you to use is still going to be there. So my goal with this podcast has always been to look at and understand the things that drive us to use. For me, it was largely a feeling of helplessness, not understanding what I should or could do to make certain things happen or to protect myself. My education did a lot to fix that. My degree is in communication, which basically means understanding how messages move and what makes people act. That came in pretty handy when I sat down to begin this project, because I had to do more than just tisk the war on drugs. I had to offer a viable alternative. That alternative, of course, is harm reduction, and it's already working wonderfully in other countries across the globe. Nothing I talk about is a secret, but it's usually buried under cultural stories and traditions that strike people as much more acceptable than what I'm preaching. Like when someone we care about is drinking too much or acting like they have a sex addiction, we've been taught to intervene, to sit them down, dump a heavy dose of guilt and shame on them, and then offer them an ultimatum. Stop using or I'm out of your life. That's a cultural tradition, one that's been turbocharged in recent decades with the popularity of shame TV shows like Intervention. And of course, that's because it's not just parents who find it hard to talk to kids about drugs and easier to just say, don't use. It's also friends. It's really hard to support someone through an addiction. It's easier to just say, get clean or else. Addiction is real, and it's heavy. When it shows up in our lives, we usually don't know what to do. But it's natural to want to do something. And when we finally do something, it feels good even if it doesn't really work. SSRIs, 12-step programs, rehab facilities, church. We have tons of placebos to choose from in the United States. I did an entire episode on the origins and failure rates of the 12-step program a few weeks back, and another one on SSRIs called Placebo Effect. So check those out if you want more information on our cultural traditions of requiring people to participate in treatments that have been shown to be ineffective. But I want to focus here on what we can do and what works, since what we're doing right now is not helping very much at all. The first thing we can do is look around and pull our heads out of our asses. The United States is not the greatest country on earth at everything. We might be the greatest country on earth when it comes to some things, building weapons, letting media delude us, choosing punishment over effective rehabilitation, taking pride in always positioning ourselves as the wokest, greatest, best generation ever, even as we look back and realize every generation in our history has said the same thing. We're best at quitting before the job is done. We're great at lots of stuff, but we aren't great at managing drug addictions. The rest of the world is way ahead of us on this one. You can check out my episode called What It's Like in Places Where Drugs Are Legal in the article linked in this episode description if you want to learn more about the specifics of each country. But the short story is that every country that's decriminalized and or created methods for users to get those drugs from safe suppliers instead of from illegal dealers, they've all seen a massive reduction in overdose deaths, diseases related to addiction, crime related to addiction, and even addiction itself. It sounds weird to our Western ears, but the best way to fix addiction is to legalize and regulate the drugs people become addicted to, then send them to doctors, therapists, counselors, and pharmacists to get those drugs. That doesn't mean selling heroin next to Tylenol, not by a long shot. But it does mean, 1, making sure no one ever goes to prison because of discomfort that causes them to seek relief in a drug, and 2, making sure nobody is forced to buy those drugs in unsafe formulations from illegal underworld dealers. When heroin and cocaine cost what they should, say $5 per gram, users will switch back to these safer forms of their drugs of choice. And more importantly, we won't use the stronger forms of these drugs as often. If I was actively using opioids and my options were codeine, a couple morphine pills, fentanyl, or heroin, on most days, I'd opt for the lighter codeine buzz so I could remain alert and engaged. But the iron law of prohibition makes smuggling bulky pills too expensive and risky. For illegal dealers, it's better to just ship fentanyl in its compact, potent form, and then, like many street dealers have started doing, press it into the shape of whatever pill your public is asking for. Vicodin, Tylenol 3, Oxycontin, Percocet. Tom Petty and Mac Miller both allegedly overdosed because they took Percocet-like pills that turned out to be fentanyl. Pharmacies don't have any incentive to pull this deadly trick, but U.S. culture has made sure that street dealers always will. Which brings me to strategic incentives, the value we place on things that encourage us to act in a certain way, and to the way they often disappear in a capitalistic culture like ours. I don't run ads on this podcast. At first, this was just a simple choice. I didn't have anyone asking. But nowadays, the host company I use to post these episodes sends me a monthly summary of downloads, listen time, location of subscribers, stuff like that. And with it, they include a teaser that says you could have made X dollars this month. It was $12, then $50, then $100, and to be honest, as that number's grown, I've kind of wondered what it would take to get me to reconsider my stance. If the next one says you could have made $2 million this month, I can promise you I'd be taking a long look at the offer. Effective altruism is a topic for another day, but it basically reminds us of our moral obligation to ease suffering where we can. And that means using our limited time and energy on this planet to do the most good for the most people. The go-to example here is a sought-after, top-of-their-field doctor who could quit their private practice to work pro bono in a developing nation, where she might impact the lives of hundreds of people every year. She could, alternatively, keep working at her practice, get super rich, and then donate millions of dollars to projects building hospitals and training pro bono workers to fill them, thereby impacting the lives of millions of people every year. Which should she do? According to effective altruism, the second choice is the better choice because she'll do more good in the end, even though she'll also, bonus, not have her life upset all that much. So if I was offered $1 million, I'd have to do my math based on the same criteria. But for now, the reason I don't run ads is because capitalism ensures there's no such thing as just running an ad. If I choose to advertise Fritos corn chips tomorrow, I'll also have to agree to not promote their competitors. I'd have to watch myself when it comes to any negative statements about things like farming, packaging, or even advertising. I might even be asked to read the ad myself, the new norm in podcasting. And I don't feel comfortable moving from real talk about drugs, crime, and life into pitches for unhealthy comfort foods, or what we might better call legal drugs. Fritos clearly won't be calling me anytime soon. A lot of that censorship I'm talking about, it happens behind the scenes. It's self-imposed in a way that warps our priorities without us noticing. And that's my biggest reason for just avoiding advertisers altogether. I get a lot of emails from listeners of this podcast, but I also get quite a few from other podcast hosts. And here's where the advertising piece really hit home for me recently. I don't follow the status quo script. You know, the one that says, I used to use drugs, but now, by the grace of God, I'm clean and sober for 18 months and rebuilding my life. That's not me. I am not clean and sober, and my life is just fine. Of course, I get it. Many people are on that clean and sober journey. And if you're one of them, and it's working for you, power to you. Keep going. But for many of us, the idea of not using drugs is a deal breaker. I really like drugs. Most people like drugs. Your coffee, Xanax, edibles, cigarettes, Vicodin, wine. They're only different from the heroin user's dope in one regard. They're legal. And because of that, they're both cheaper and safer. But I don't draw those distinctions between legal drugs and illegal drugs very often. That's deliberate, by the way. Borders between good drugs and bad drugs leave people in jail or on the streets. Drugs are drugs. If you're taking or doing something to make yourself feel better, that's a drug. So anyway, when I get these invites from other podcast hosts, I've learned the hard way to ask them to chat before the show, so they don't waste their time on an interview they wind up not wanting to publish. And half the time, more than half actually, we never have a second conversation because they realize they don't want me on their show. That's because I don't back off my truth when they mention that they're pressing a message of clean and sober. They cancel it because both their audience and their sponsors might stop playing along if they don't toe the line. If someone like me comes on their show and starts telling listeners that drug use is normal and that recovery doesn't require sobriety, the host might lose profits. Most of them don't want to risk that. And for some reason, that annoys the fuck out of me. Capitalism corrupts morals in ways that feel way too natural. We sometimes don't even notice. And that's the real point of this podcast. Stigma is our problem. It's not just drug users, although that one's pretty obvious here. But on one of these recent conversations with a podcast host who preaches that 12-step sobriety message, the stigma propped up by capitalistic concerns about their sponsorship, it bled past me and onto my people, those in prison. Their argument went something like this, although I want to avoid putting anyone on blast, so I'll keep both the accuser and the accused anonymous. The host of this other podcast asked me about someone I knew, someone who's actually impressed me quite a bit in their ability to rise above their circumstances and recreate their identity from inside a prison. So this host wanted to know what I thought about having this person on their show. And after I assured them that it would be a great invite, I was rewarded with this reply. Yeah, but they're a convicted sex offender, and I don't want to lose sponsors or listeners by giving them a platform. Fuck. Needless to say, our conversation didn't last much longer. I reminded them that the guest wouldn't be talking about, and certainly wouldn't be glamorizing their crimes. I reminded them that the guest had tons of expertise in their area. And I tried to convince them that incarcerated people live life weighted down by stigma, but that people like us, podcast hosts, drug war opponents, convicted criminals outside of prison, we're some of the few who can work to change that stigma by platforming people who can smash preconceptions and humanize those behind bars. None of it seemed to land. And even though our meeting ended with this person promising they would get back to me to schedule an interview in the future, they never did. That's also not unusual. So I don't do sponsors because I don't want to work within that system of controlled speech, reinscribed stigma, and disciplined silence. If I ever get to a point where this show needs money for something, I think I'll probably turn it over to you, the listeners, and let you decide if it's worth it. That's the updated model I hope to see spread in the future, one where corporate billionaires no longer get to decide what we hear and what we don't. Shout out to Sam Harris for popularizing this model, by the way. And also, shout out to Sam Harris for donating free books to my incarcerated students for class this semester. I'm really looking forward to this one, y'all. We're going to read Free Will. Which brings me to my job, teaching college classes inside prisons. My students aren't jaywalkers and speeders. They've taken lives, they've scarred people, they've hurt families, and they've broken spirits. But what do we stand to gain by locking them in an expensive hole and forcing them to adopt the identity of piece of shit? The only reason I'm not on the other side of my prison classroom, filling one of the student chairs instead of the instructor chair, is luck. That's it. And the only reason you aren't in prison for hurting a kid or for killing somebody or for a robbery gone bad, it's also luck. Maybe that's a good thought experiment to end on here. Because chances are you're arguing with everything inside you against that last claim. Luck my ass, you might be saying to yourself. I never hurt a kid, and I never would. But that just begs the question, why not? I've never had to talk myself out of hurting a kid. I've never had to argue myself down from a murder plot or a sexual assault that I really wanted to carry out. I don't have those urges, but I can't take credit for not having those urges. They simply never arose in me the same way they clearly did arise in others. I don't deserve credit for my lucky draw. But what are the people who have struggled with the same things I do, but when I said, no, I don't want to do that, they said, yes, I will, or they gave in? What of them? Aren't I entitled to a little bit of credit for pulling myself up by my bootstraps and resisting the temptation they gave into? Only if you can explain where the strength, desire, and urge to even say no came from. And only if it came from you, not from your upbringing or your genetics or your memory of something that happened to you in the 6th grade. Your ability to resist an urge that someone else succumbs to, your desire to even want to resist it, it all arises out of the dark depths of unconscious thought. You're only a witness to your actions, never the author. That doesn't mean people aren't responsible for their crimes. That's yet another topic for yet another day, maybe alongside the effective altruism topic. But it does mean that the responsibility for incentivizing the behaviors we want to see played out in the daily lives of those around us, it's on us. If we want to build a culture where redemption is an option and where people released from prison can re-enter society without tons of barriers, we have to make sure their stories are available and that their paths are clear. This project shouldn't wait until someone is in prison to begin, and it shouldn't end once they're released. Identity is the answer, or at least a big part of the answer, to many of our current social issues. If I know that I'm the piece of shit I described earlier, the one who spent time in prison years back and is working to overcome my past, but who also understands that I won't and maybe shouldn't be allowed access to many of my culture's most respected jobs, well then my identity will revolve around that truth, and I'll do much different math when I'm tempted to, say, rob a liquor store than I would if I were a lawyer who has court tomorrow, or a professor who's headed into prison to teach a class. Stigma is poison to both the person applying it and to the person it's applied to. Love yourselves and the addicted people in your life. I'm Ben Boyce.
Nothing gives your old lunch new life like Fritos brand corn chips. So munchy, so full of good corn taste.
If you're still here, you might want more. So consider checking out my book, Dr. Junkie, one man's story of addiction and crime that will challenge everything you know about the war on drugs. You can get it wherever you buy books. If you want to know what the world would look like if drugs were legal, or why we develop tolerance and sensitization to drugs when we take them for extended periods, or if you just want to know why I went to prison, check out the book.